In 1976, the United States had a birthday party so large that it ended up in people's pockets. That is not a metaphor. The US Mint redesigned the quarter, the half-dollar and the dollar coin with special bicentennial designs and the dates 1776, 1976. So for a while, even buying a cup of coffee could mean handling a tiny piece of national memory, and coins were only the beginning. In 1976, America turned 200 years old. 2 centuries had passed since the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4, 1776. A country that had begun as 13 rebellious colonies was now a continental superpower, with highways, television networks, nuclear weapons, fast food chains, shopping malls, and a serious case of birthday fever. The bicentennial was everywhere. It was on coins and stamps. It was on posters, belt buckles, license plates, mugs, plates, shirts, toys, cereal boxes, public buildings, parade floats, television specials, and probably a few objects that had no real patriotic business wearing an eagle. For one strange year, America did not just remember 1776. It merchandised it. Now, that sounds funny, and it is. There is something wonderfully odd about watching a country turn its founding story into collectible plates. But like most forgotten bits of history, the bicentennial becomes much more interesting once we ask why it happened when it did. Because 1976 was not a simple, confident moment. The United States had recently come out of the Vietnam War. Watergate had badly damaged trust in government. President Richard Nixon had resigned only 2 years earlier. Inflation was hurting ordinary families. Cities were struggling. The country felt powerful, but also tired, suspicious, and unsure of itself. So America did what nations often do when the present feels unstable. It reached backward. It reached for a cleaner story. 1776, liberty, independence, founders, flags, fireworks, and the idea that Americans, despite all their divisions, had once shared a beginning. That is why the bicentennial was never just a birthday. It was an argument about memory. The federal government had been preparing for years. The American Revolution Bicentennial Administration helped coordinate events and projects across the country. Towns, schools, museums, historical societies, churches, businesses, and local committees all found ways to participate. Some communities restored old buildings. Others organized parades, concerts, reenactments, lectures, exhibits, and time capsules. This is one reason the bicentennial worked so well as a national moment. It could be huge and local at the same time. In Washington and Philadelphia, officials could give speeches about the meaning of the revolution. In a small town, a school band could march past a fire truck covered in bunting, while someone dressed like Benjamin Franklin waved from a float. Both were part of the same anniversary. And then there were the spectacles. One of the most famous was Operation Sail in New York Harbor. Tall ships from around the world arrived to mark the anniversary, turning the harbor into a forest of masts and flags. Millions watched from shore or on television. It was history as pageant, a young republic presenting itself through old sailing ships, even though by 1976 the United States was also a country of jets, satellites, and aircraft carriers. That contrast was part of the magic. The bicentennial let Americans imagine themselves as both ancient and modern, both revolutionary and established, both scrappy rebels and world leaders. It took the rough, uncertain, violent history of the revolution and turned it into something that could fit on a commemorative spoon. That brings us to the other side of the story. By the mid-1970s, the bicentennial had become so commercial that critics mocked it as the Buy-centennial, and honestly, that pun deserves to be remembered. Companies wrapped their products in patriotic colors, souvenirs multiplied. Colonial imagery became a sales language. If you could print 1776, 1976 on something, someone probably did. The line between civic memory and marketing became very thin, but it would be too easy to dismiss the whole thing as kitsch. Yes, the bicentennial produced a mountain of souvenirs. Some were sincere, some were tacky, some were both, which is often the most American category of object. But underneath the commercial noise, the anniversary did something real. It made ordinary people think about history in public. It invited Americans to ask where they lived in the national story. A farmer in Iowa, a teacher in Pennsylvania, a veteran in California, a child in Texas, a factory worker in Ohio, and a tourist in New York could all encounter the bicentennial in different ways. A coin, a parade, a museum exhibit, a school assignment, a televised ceremony, a family road trip to a historic site. That is the strange power of public history. It does not always arrive as a book or a lecture. Sometimes it arrives as a quarter in your hand. Of course, the bicentennial also had limits. The version of 1776 that America celebrated in 1976 was often tidy. It loved the founding fathers, the Liberty Bell, the Declaration, and the flag. It was less comfortable with slavery, native dispossession, women's political exclusion, loyalists, class conflict, or the fact that the revolution meant very different things to different people. National anniversaries tend to simplify. They need symbols that can travel quickly. A flag travels well. A complicated argument about who was included in all men are created equal does not fit quite so neatly on a bumper sticker. But that tension is exactly why the bicentennial is worth remembering. It shows how a nation chooses what parts of its past to make visible. It shows how memory becomes ceremony, ceremony becomes merchandise, and merchandise somehow becomes memory again. And it matters now because America is approaching another major birthday. On July the 4th, 2026, the United States will mark 250 years since the Declaration of Independence. The America 250 effort is already framing that anniversary as a chance to commemorate the country's founding, reflect on its complexity, and think about its future. Museums, states, communities, and federal institutions are preparing programs. The Smithsonian has described the anniversary not only as a celebration of achievement, but also as a moment to confront consequences and imagine what democracy might become. In other words, America is about to do this again. The question is whether 2026 will simply repeat 1976, or whether it will tell a larger story. The 1976 bicentennial was patriotic, commercial, sincere, excessive, and sometimes a little ridiculous. It covered the country in 1776 because Americans wanted a shared symbol badly enough to stamp it onto coins, parade it through streets, sail it into harbors, and sell it on coffee mugs. But maybe that is not just ridiculous. Maybe it is revealing. A nation's birthday is never only about the past. It is about what people in the present need the past to do for them. In 1976, Americans needed 1776 to reassure them that the country still had a common beginning. In 2026, Americans may ask 1776 to do something harder, not only to unite but to explain, not only to celebrate but to include, not only to inspire pride, but to survive scrutiny. That is a heavier task for an old year printed on a coin. Still, there is something moving about it. A republic grows older. Its symbols get reused, argued over, polished, sold, forgotten, rediscovered, and sometimes redeemed. A date becomes a slogan. A slogan becomes a souvenir. A souvenir becomes a relic in someone's drawer, and decades later, someone finds it and asks, "Why did this matter so much?" That is the little doorway into the larger history. The bicentennial was not just a party. It was America trying to remember itself at a moment when memory felt useful, marketable, and necessary. And that history, odd souvenirs and all, deserves to be remembered.